Hey guys, welcome to Wema DevOps. In this video, I want to show you how to use a provider alias, how to use what we call a Terraform Meta-Argument. A meta-argument in Terraform, it is an argument that you can pass either on a resource or a module that will just alter the behavior. It is not changing the resource itself as you create it, but it's just altering the behavior of how Terraform works with it. So an example is we have about 5 or 6 meta-arguments. We have a count meta-argument. So if I have a resource and I pass a count as a meta-argument, maybe I have the same resource. A resource could be an EC2 instance if I'm working in AWS, or a VPC. And let's say I want to create, using the same code, using the same resource block, I want to create 2 of the same thing, 2 of the same resource if I'm creating a VPC or an EC2 instance. So I can use a count meta-argument. So what it will do is that it will alter the behavior of how Terraform is going to work with that. Today, I'm going to show you how to work with what we call a provider meta-argument. So with this, let me just share my screen right here. So I'm in a directory called provider here. If I ls, I realize that I do not have anything. So I can create a file. I can call it main.tf, okay? Main.tf. So within this particular file, within this particular main.tf, so I can just pass a provider. I can specify what my provider is, and I can say my provider is AWS. Yeah? My provider is AWS, like this. So once I specify this provider, this will become my default provider. If I specify a region within this provider, then whatever resource that I create, it will be created in the region that is specified. Okay. Now, if I don't pass a region within my provider, then what that means is that the resource created will be created in the default region. The default region that has been set. But let's say I now want to create an EC2 instance. So I'll use a resource. I can say I want to use a resource. It's an AWS instance. Instance. And I can call this instance, let's say test. I can give it a name that is local to Terraform. That is a test instance. I'll need to provide, these are some parameters, or these are arguments that I need to supply. I need to supply an instant type. So I can say I want to create a T2 micro. Yeah. And for the AMI, let me use a data source. So let me copy a data source that I have from a different file, and let me provide this data source here. So that's my data source. That's my data source. This data source, it is just going to return an Ubuntu AMI. It's going to return an Ubuntu AMI. So I'm using this data source, and therefore from the main, to get the AMI, I'm going to use data, right? Dot, it is my AMI. Dot, what is the name of the AMI? Ubuntu. But what attribute do I want to return? Because this data source will return a bunch of attributes when we run it, right? Attributes about that AMI. But I'm interested in the ID because we want the AMI ID, the AMI ID. So now with this, if I initialize this and I try to run this and create it, this instance is going to be created in my default region. Now I can check my default region. If I can do AWS, how did I set my default region? When you do AWS configure, when you run that command, you are able to set your default credentials. Part of the default credentials that you set is your default region. So I have my default region set as US West 2. So it means that if I run this, I plan to create this instance, it is going to be created in US West 2, unless within the provider, right, I specify a region, right? I can specify a region and I say, now this is US East 1, okay, US East 1. So because I've specified the region within my provider, therefore this instance will now no longer be created in the default region. So it will be created in US East 1, because that is the argument that I've specified within my provider. We're now working with US East 1. Now, if I run this instance, if I run that, okay, so the first thing I'll have to do is I'll have to initialize it, run Terraform init. So once I initialize it, what initializing does is it downloads for us the plugin. It downloads for us the plugin from the Terraform registry, but it also sets a log file. So that log file, as we have seen, it is our provider. We are using AWS, and it has downloaded the latest version of that particular log file. Okay. So once we go back to a main, if I do a plan, if I do Terraform plan, now right here, I'll see that it is using my data source, and it has returned this AMI. Now this AMI has been returned from US East 1. Okay. US East 1. Why? Because AMIs are region specific. So if we take a note of this AMI, it ends with E99F. Now, what if I say my region is US West 2, okay, my default region, and I went ahead again and I ran Terraform plan, right? Terraform plan. Now, because I've specified a different region in my provider, so my data source is pulling now an AMI from a different region. AMIs, as we know, are region specific. So this is the AMI that is being pulled from US West 2. So if we have a situation whereby I want to provision 2 instances and I want to provision them in 2 different regions, okay? 2 different regions. So right here, I have a provider that I have specified. Now, if I remove this region, if I remove the region, then this is now sets it to my default region, which is US West 2. So if I run this one more time, then we will see that it is going to pull the same AMI. It's going to pull the same AMI because it's pulling it from the default region. Okay. Now, if I need to provision another instance, so let me just copy this. Let me just duplicate this, copy this, and duplicate. And now this, I'll say this is test 1, or let me say this is east. That's the name. And let me say this is west. This is west. Okay. This is west. Now, because I'm using the same data source, I'm using the same data source. Now, if I want to provision this resource in US West, which is my default region, then my provider, I will leave my provider as it is, because that is the default provider. But if I would like to provision it now in the East region, then I will need to create what you call a provider alias. So I'll have to specify another provider, which is AWS. Okay. But now within here, I'll need to pass an argument. I'll need to create an alias. And this alias, I'll say this is East. Okay. An alias East. And with that alias East, I'll need to specify the region. The region is US East 1. Okay. So now I have created an alias for my provider. Now with this, I cannot use this provider alias with this region to create my resource. But for me to create this resource, now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pass a provider within my resource. So this is a meta argument. It is going to alter the behavior of this resource, because by default, this resource will be created in the default region. But if I want to alter how Terraform is going to create this resource, such that it is going to create this in US West, which is the default region, and this, it is going to be created in US East, which is my alias. Or if I put a region here, I can still do region, and I can specify a region. Let's say US West 1, because my default region is US West 2. Now, if I pass a region here as US West 1, then this instance is going to be created in US West 1. But when I use the provider alias, right, with the meta argument of provider, then I'll need to specify it as it is AWS but .east, right? Because that is the alias. It is an AWS, provider is AWS, but the alias is East. So I'll specify provider is AWS.east. Now with this, still, now I'm a step closer to meeting my objective, right? Because now I have going to alter the behavior of how this resource will be provisioned. So it should now no longer be provisioned in West, but it should be provisioned now in East. But let's see whether that is going to solve our problem. So if I run Terraform plan, now it should create for us 2 resources. But what kind of AMI? What AMI is it going to pull? So if we look at the AMIs, again, we see that first it is provisioning the same, it is provisioning 2 resources. The first resource is an instance East, but the second one is West, right? Now, when we look at the AMIs, this AMI ends with 8BE. The second one ends with 8BE. So it means that it is still pulling from the same region, okay? It is pulling from the same region. So how can we mitigate this? Because now I've specified my provider, but we see that it is still, we have one data source, okay? We have one data source right here. This data source is also being pulled from the default region. So because I'm using the same data source, this data source, it is querying, it is looking for the AMI in the default region, or the region that I've set using my default provider, right? Which is US West 1, as I've specified. It is not pulling it using the alias provider. Okay. Now, for me to do that, there are multiple ways in which you can do that. But again, as we look at Terraform, we have best practices. Do I want to duplicate code? I could easily do something like this. I could copy this data source, right? I could copy this data source. I could copy it. Then I could just unduplicate it. Duplicate it. Once I duplicate it, I could change this to Ubuntu 1, right? But then once I change that, then I put a provider, okay? I specify my provider on this data source, and I say my provider is AWS.east. Okay? So I'm setting a provider in the data source. So I want this provider to also go and fetch information in using the alias, okay, using the alias. So once I've specified this, then I'll go back to my main where my resource is. And now for the AMI, since I'm using a data source, so I'm going to change this AMI, right? I'm going to change that AMI. Now, instead of it being Ubuntu, that I'll change it to 1, right? I'll change it to AMI so that it's now using my second data source, second data source, so that it's pulling it using my alias provider. I've specified a provider, east, and also the data source I've specified a provider, okay? So if I did that, let me plan it. Let me Terraform plan. Once I plan, let's see if it's going to have different AMI. So for the west, it is pulling an AMI that ends with B8, BE. What about the east? The east is ending with 2E99F. So here we see that we've been able to achieve our goal, whereby we are using the same, using a provider alias to do it, to create multiple instances. But this is not a very smart way of doing it in terms of if we want to use Terraform best practices, right? Why? Because we see that we are duplicating our code. We are writing more lines of code as needed, okay? We are having almost double the amount of lines of code. When we look at our resources right here, we are also providing double amount of resources. We are creating 2 resource blocks to create the same thing if only the AMIs are changed. So there is an easier way or a smarter way to do it, okay? So in the next video, I'm going to show you now how we can refactor this code. We can make this code a little bit more cleaner. And once we clean it up, we will use some Terraform best practices to ensure that our code is more legible, to ensure that we do not have too many lines of code as is our case. And that is what we call Terraform code refactoring, but we'll also use the concept of modules. So stay tuned for the next video. Thank you.